The Atlantic Ocean does not bargain. It is a thermodynamic engine of cold water and pressure, indifferent to the biology of those who try to navigate it. On the night of December 15th, 1900, the steamer Archtor was cutting a path from Philadelphia to Leith. The ship was navigating the dark waters of the Outer Hebrides, a jagged archipelago off the west coast of Scotland. This is a region where navigation is less about calculation and more about survival. Captain Homan stood on the bridge of the Archtor. He was looking for a specific vector of safety. He was looking for the Flannan Isles. Specifically, he was looking for Eilean Mor. Eilean Mor is the largest of the 7 hunters, a cluster of rocks that break the surface of the ocean like broken teeth. Perched on top of this rock was a marvel of Victorian engineering, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, 75 feet of white masonry, housing a light capable of generating 140,000 candle power. It was a binary star in the void, a constant reassurance that order existed in the chaos of the North Atlantic. It flashed twice in rapid succession every 30 seconds. That was the heartbeat. That was the protocol. But at midnight on December 15th, Captain Homan saw nothing. The horizon where the light should have been was a wall of black static. The Archtor passed within 5 miles of the island. The bridge crew strained their eyes against the salt spray and the darkness. They checked their chronometers. They checked their charts. They waited for the sweep of the beam. It never came. The darkness was absolute. This was the first anomaly. A lighthouse does not simply turn off. In the year 1900, the Northern Lighthouse Board operated with military precision. 3 men were always on duty. 3 men whose sole purpose was to keep the mantle burning and the lens rotating. For the light to fail, the system itself had to have collapsed. Captain Homan noted the outage in the ship's log. When the Archtor docked in Oban 3 days later, the report was filed. But the machinery of communication was slow. The telegraph wires were down. The ocean was churning. A storm was building. A massive low-pressure system that would hammer the Hebrides for a week. The silence from Eilean Mor stretched out. It was not until December 26th, Boxing Day, that the lighthouse tender Hesperus was finally able to make the crossing. The Hesperus was the relief vessel. On board was Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, anxious to start his shift and relieve one of the 3 men stationed on the rock. The approach of the Hesperus to the island is where the true strangeness begins. This is not a ghost story yet. This is a procedural failure. Captain James Harvey of the Hesperus brought the ship within hailing distance. Standard protocol dictated a specific sequence of greetings. The ship hoisted its ensign flag. The lighthouse was required to respond by hoisting its own flag. The ship waited. The flagpole on the lighthouse remained bare. Captain Harvey ordered the ship's whistle to be sounded. The sharp, mechanical shriek echoed off the cliffs of Eilean Moor, startling the seabirds, but triggering no human response. Harvey ordered a rocket to be fired. A flare arced into the gray sky, exploding with a dull thud that was immediately swallowed by the wind. They watched the gallery of the lighthouse, looking for the silhouette of a keeper, a wave, a signal. The gallery was empty. The island was dead. Joseph Moore was lowered into a small boat. The ocean was still heaving with the remnants of the storm. Landing on Eilean Moor was a logistical nightmare, even in calm weather. The island has 2 landing stages, east and west, designed to offer an option depending on the swell. They approached the east landing. As Moore jumped from the boat onto the slippery concrete of the jetty, the sensory details of the abandonment began to accumulate. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence of nature. The wind was howling, and the waves were crashing against the basalt columns with violence, but the silence of industry. The usual reception was absent. There was no one to catch the mooring line. There was no one to help lift the heavy provision boxes. Moore began the ascent. There are 160 steep steps cut into the rock, leading from the landing stage up to the lighthouse compound. He walked up the stairs, his heart rate climbing with every step. The air was cold and smelled of brine and wet stone. He reached the entrance gate to the compound. It was closed. This was a minor detail, but in the rigid life of a keeper, it was a deviation. He unlatched it and walked into the courtyard. The 75-foot tower loomed above him, white and sterile. The windows were dark. Moore shouted. He called out the names of the 3 men who should have been there: Thomas Marshall, James Dockett, Donald MacArthur. His voice was stripped away by the wind the moment it left his throat. He approached the main door of the lighthouse. It was closed. He opened it. He stepped into the entrance hall. The air inside was still. It carried the smell of stagnant air and cold ash. The heavy outer door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the roar of the ocean. Now he was inside the machine. Moore climbed the spiral staircase to the living quarters. The sound of his own boots on the metal treads was deafening in the quiet. He reached the kitchen. This was the heart of the keeper's domestic life. The kitchen door was open. Moore stepped inside. The scene before him was not one of struggle. It was not a scene of chaos. It was a scene of suspended animation. It was as if the timeline of the lighthouse had simply been severed. The fire in the grate was out, not just banked or low, but dead. The ashes were cold to the touch. This meant the fire had been out for days. In the damp chill of December in the Hebrides, allowing the fire to die was unthinkable. It was the only source of heat. Moore looked at the table. There is a persistent myth that a meal was found half-eaten, with chairs overturned. That is folklore. The reality, the clinical reality recorded in the official inquiry, is far more unsettling. The kitchen was clean. The plates were washed. The floor was swept. Everything was in its place. The orderliness was aggressive. It suggested that whatever happened did not happen during a meal. It happened during the waiting. Moore moved to the bedrooms. The beds were empty. They were unmade. The sheets tossed back as if the occupants had risen and left in a hurry, or simply never returned to them. He checked the equipment. He found a set of oilskins, the heavy, waterproof gear keepers wore to brave the storms. This was a critical data point. There were 3 keepers on the island. There were 3 sets of oilskins on the rack, but one set was missing. This meant that one man had gone out into the storm properly dressed. 2 men had gone out in their shirt sleeves. In December, in a gale, Moore continued his climb. He went up to the light room. The lens, that massive, beautiful piece of optics, was still. The curtains that protected the glass from the sun were drawn. The lamp was cleaned. The oil fountains were full. The mechanism was ready to be lit. It was waiting for a hand that never came. Everything was prepared. Everything was ready. The machine was functional. Only the operators were deleted. Moore went back down to the kitchen. He stood in the center of the room, trying to process the sensory input. The cold, the silence, the perfect order. Then he looked at the wall. There was a clock on the kitchen wall, a standard regulator clock designed to keep perfect time, vital for the logging of weather and light operations. The pendulum was still. The hands of the clock were frozen. They did not point to the current time. They pointed to a moment in the past. The clock had stopped. This is the detail that anchors the high strangeness of the scene. A stopped clock in a lighthouse is a symbol of total systemic failure. Keepers' wind clocks. It is a reflex. It is part of the rhythm of their existence. For the clock to stop, the men had to have been gone long enough for the mechanism to unwind completely. Moore stood there, listening to the silence of the stopped clock. He realized then that he was standing in a tomb. Not a tomb of bodies, but a tomb of time. The timeline of Eileen Moore had ended days ago. He turned and ran. He ran back down the spiral stairs, his footsteps clanging against the iron. He ran out of the lighthouse, through the courtyard, and back down the 160 steps to the landing stage. He signaled the Hesperus. He needed help. He could not be alone on this rock. Captain Harvey sent 2 more men ashore to verify Moore's findings. They conducted a grid search of the small island. They walked the perimeter of the cliffs. They checked the west landing. They checked the east landing. They found nothing. No bodies. No notes. But they did find the logbook. The logbook lay on the desk in the kitchen, the last testament of the 3 men. It was the only thing that could speak. Moore and the sailors from the Hesperus gathered around it. They opened the slate to the final entries. What they read did not match the reality of the lighthouse. The lighthouse was solid. The equipment was secure. But the words written in the logbook described a disintegration of reality that physics could not explain. The final entry was dated December 15th, the same day the light failed. But before we analyze the text, we must understand the context of the location. We must understand the impossible geography of the West Landing, because what the search party found there later that afternoon defied the laws of structural engineering. They went to the West Landing, the side of the island most exposed to the Atlantic swell. There they found a scene of violence that the lighthouse itself had been spared. Iron railings cemented into the rock were bent like wire. A block of stone weighing more than a ton had been displaced. A supply box, situated 110 feet above sea level, had been smashed to splinters. The damage suggested a force of impossible magnitude, a wave or a succession of waves that had reached up over the cliffs and clawed at the island itself. But here is the glitch. During the days leading up to the disappearance, the weather reports from the surrounding islands, Lewis, Harris, the mainland, indicated rough weather, yes, but nothing apocalyptic, nothing that could bend iron at 100 feet above the sea. And yet the damage was there. The crew of the Hesperus stood on the edge of the cliff, looking down into the churning white water. They were looking at a physical impossibility, a storm that existed only for this one rock, a localized event of cataclysmic energy. The sun began to set. The darkness was returning to Eileen Moore. The men knew they had to make a decision. The light had to be lit. The protocol had to be maintained. Joseph Moore volunteered to stay. He would remain on the island, alone, to keep the light burning. 3 volunteers from the Hesperus joined him. As the Hesperus pulled away, leaving the 4 men on the rock, the silence returned. The wind picked up. The ocean hammered the cliffs. Inside the lighthouse, Joseph Moore wound the clock. He started the pendulum. Time began to move again. But the feeling remained. The sensation that they were being watched. The sensation that the 3 men, Marshall, Duckett, and MacArthur, were not gone. They were simply elsewhere, displaced. Moore sat at the kitchen table. the same table where the previous keepers had sat. He opened the logbook again. He looked at the entries leading up to the 15th. He read the handwriting of Thomas Marshall. The ink was dry. The words were terrifying. They spoke of a storm, but not just a storm of wind and rain. They spoke of tears. They spoke of prayer. They spoke of 3 hardened men, veterans of the sea, breaking down in the face of something they could not comprehend. The investigation was just beginning. The physical evidence was a puzzle with missing pieces, but the psychological evidence, the logbook, was about to open a door that should have remained shut. The incident was over. The mystery had begun. The light was on, sweeping across the dark water, flashing twice every 30 seconds. But the signal it sent was no longer just a warning to ships. It was a question mark burned into the night. To understand the Flannan Isles incident, we must strip away the maritime romance. We must ignore the folklore of sea monsters and phantom birds, and look strictly at the operational data. When Captain Harvey and the relief crew entered the lighthouse, they did not walk into a supernatural crime scene. They walked into a series of procedural violations and physical inconsistencies that, when layered together, create a picture of impossible logic. We begin inside the living quarters. The kitchen. The first anomaly is the clock. It hung on the wall above the fireplace, a standard issue mechanical timepiece. It had stopped. This is not merely a detail of atmosphere. It is a timestamp of abandonment. These clocks were driven by weights and pendulums. They required human intervention, winding every 24 to 48 hours. A stopped clock in a lighthouse is a red flag of the highest order. It signifies that the routine, the very heartbeat of the station, had ceased long before the relief ship arrived. The hands had stopped, but the environment suggested a sudden, rather than gradual, halt. The fire in the grate was dead, leaving only cold ash. However, the table was set. There was a meal prepared: mutton, potatoes, and pickles. It was plated, ready to be eaten, but untouched. This presents the first behavioral fracture. Lighthouse keepers operate on a rigid rotation. They eat, they watch, they sleep. The presence of a prepared meal implies the keepers were inside, ready to sit down. Whatever pulled them out of that room did not allow them the 30 minutes required to consume their dinner. It was instantaneous. It overrode the basic biological imperative of hunger and the structural imperative of the schedule. We move to the entrance hall. Here we find the second, and perhaps most critical, physical anomaly: the equipment roster. The regulations of the Northern Lighthouse Board were absolute. No keeper was to leave the secure structure of the lighthouse during a storm without wearing their protective oilskins and sea boots. To do so would be suicidal negligence. On the rack by the door, the relief crew found one set of oilskins missing. They found a second set of oilskins missing, but the third set, belonging to Donald MacArthur, was still hanging on its peg. This single coat destroys almost every conventional theory regarding a wave sweeping them away. If the three men went out together to secure equipment during a storm, MacArthur would have been wearing his gear. He was a veteran mariner with years of experience. He knew the bite of the Atlantic. He would not step out into a gale in his shirt sleeves. Conversely, if the weather was calm, why did the other two men put on their heavy storm gear? The presence of that coat suggests a scenario that defies protocol. It implies that two men went out properly dressed, perhaps to attend to something routine, and something happened to them. It implies that MacArthur, the third man, rushed out improperly dressed to assist them. But this creates a paradox of time. If the danger was immediate enough to make a veteran forget his coat, how did he manage to leave the kitchen intact? The chair was not overturned. The plates were not smashed. The scene inside was calm. The evidence by the door suggests panic. The two data sets do not align. We must then look at the logbook. This is where the narrative shifts from a physical mystery to a data corruption. The logbook is the black box of the lighthouse. It records the weather, the fuel consumption, and the state of the light. The entries leading up to the disappearance are written in the hand of Thomas Marshall, the second assistant. The entry for December 12th states, "Gale north by northwest. Sea lashed to fury. Never seen such a storm." The entry for December 13th details the storm continuing. It notes that the men were praying. Here is the glitch. Post-incident analysis of the meteorological data from the surrounding area, including logs from the steamship Archtor, which passed nearby, and the station at Lewis, shows that on December 12th and 13th, the weather in the region was calm. There was no gale. The atmospheric pressure was stable. The sea was moderate. The severe storm that battered the Flannan Isles did not physically arrive until December 14th and 15th. Yet Thomas Marshall documented a storm on the 12th that terrified 3 hardened seamen. He wrote that James Duckett, the principal keeper, was very quiet. He wrote that Donald MacArthur, a man known for his brawling and toughness, was crying. Why would MacArthur cry over a storm? He had survived far worse. Why would they document a fury that the barometer did not register? We are left with 2 possibilities. 1, the logbook entries are a fabrication, written by a man suffering from a breakdown, hallucinating a storm before it arrived. 2, the weather at the Flannan Isles was experiencing a localized, hyperviolent anomaly that was invisible to ships only a few dozen miles away. The entry for December 14th reads, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." This entry marks the final moment of sanity. The storm had allegedly passed. The weather was calm. And yet, this is the day they vanished. If the storm was over, why did the accident happen then? If the sea was calm, what force was strong enough to kill 3 men simultaneously? We must now examine the West Landing. This is the geographic point of the disappearance. The lighthouse sits atop a cliff, 150 feet above the sea. The West Landing is a concrete supply platform cut into the rock, descending toward the water. When the investigation team inspected the West Landing, they found evidence of a kinetic force that defies the logbook's claim of calm seas. An iron railing cemented into the stone had been wrenched out of the bedrock and twisted like wire. A supply box containing ropes and landing tackle had been smashed to splinters. The contents were gone, but the most disturbing piece of evidence was a block of stone. This was a massive slab of concrete, weighing over a ton, sitting well above the high tide line. It had been dislodged and moved. To move a 1-ton block of stone requires hydraulic pressure of immense magnitude. It requires a wave that does not merely crash, but impacts with the density of a freight train. The damage was located at an elevation of 110 feet above sea level. For a wave to cause mechanical damage at 110 feet, it must be a rogue event of catastrophic proportions. It requires a wall of water towering higher than the lighthouse itself. But recall the timeline. The logbook stated the storm had ended. The real storm, the one recorded by the mainland, was only just beginning on the afternoon of the 15th. The damage at the West Landing suggests a violence that occurred during the window of silence. But if such a wave hit the island, it would have been audible and visible for miles. It would have shaken the tower physically. If the men were at the landing when this impact occurred, they would not have just been washed away. They would have been atomized. However, we circle back to the anomalies of procedure. Why were they at the West Landing at all? The rules stated that the landings were only to be used for bringing in supplies. There was no supply ship scheduled. The crane was secured. The ropes were stowed. There was no operational reason for 3 men to be down at the water's edge, 150 feet below the safety of the light, especially if the weather was supposedly calm. As the final log entry stated, if they were securing gear against a coming storm, they were doing it days too late, or responding to a threat that the barometer said wasn't there yet. There is one final technical detail that is often overlooked: the light itself. When the relief ship Hesperus arrived on the 26th, the light was out, but the lamp itself was not broken. The mechanism was in perfect working order. The oil fountains were full. The wicks were trimmed. The light had burned out because the fuel in the immediate reservoir had been exhausted and not replenished. Calculations of the fuel consumption indicate that the light was last attended to on the evening of December 15th. The lamp was lit at dusk. It burned through the night, consuming its fuel, and flickered out sometime in the early morning hours of the 16th or late on the 15th. This gives us a terminal window. The men disappeared after the lamp was lit on the 15th, but before it needed winding or refilling. This creates a terrifyingly narrow funnel of time. They performed the most sacred duty of the keeper. They lit the lamp. The sun went down. The tower was operational. Then, in the dark, something drew them out. Not all at once. The code tells us that. One or two went first, down the steep, winding stairs, out into the dark, down to the west landing. The third man, MacArthur, remained in the kitchen. He was likely looking at the clock. He was waiting for them to return. The time ticked by. The wind, which shouldn't have been there, perhaps began to howl. He realized they were gone too long. He stood up from the table. He did not take the time to put on his oilskins. He did not take the time to bank the fire. He opened the heavy door and stepped out into the blackness of the cliff edge. And then the data stream ends. The clock ticks on for a few more hours, then stops. The fire burns down to ash. The light above rotates, sweeping the empty ocean, burning its fuel drop by drop, signaling to no one, until it too inevitably dies. The facility was left in a state of suspended animation, a machine running without its operators. The anomalies do not point to a simple accident. An accident is a slip, a fall, a singular tragedy. This was a systemic failure of reality. The weather that didn't exist, the gear that wasn't worn, the damage that shouldn't be possible at that altitude. We are left not with a crime scene, but with a puzzle box where the pieces are from different puzzles. The physical evidence tells a story of a 100-foot wave. The written evidence tells a story of mental disintegration. The procedural evidence tells a story of panic. None of them fit together. And in the silence of the lighthouse, the only thing that remains consistent is the absence. This leads us to the final piece of the investigation, the aftermath. When the relief keepers took over, they tried to restart the machine, but the atmosphere of the Flannan Isles had changed. The glitch had not fully resolved. That is where we must turn next, to the investigation that followed, and the things the relief crew heard in the wind when they were left alone on the rock. The investigation into the Flannan Isles disappearance is not defined by what was found, but by the accumulation of static, when we act as digital archaeologists, sifting through the digitized scans of the Northern Lighthouse Board archives. We are looking for a signal in the noise. But in the case of Eileen Moore, the noise is the only thing that remains. The timeline fractures the moment Joseph Moore steps onto the East Landing. From that point backward, history is a corrupted file. We have the physical reality of the lighthouse, a structure of iron and stone designed to withstand the Atlantic. And we have the official report filed by Superintendent Robert Muirhead. Between these two solid points lies a vacuum that no amount of forensic reconstruction has ever been able to fill. Let us look at the data that leads nowhere. On December 26, 1900, Superintendent Muirhead arrived on the island to conduct the official inquiry. He was a practical man, an engineer responsible for the construction of the lighthouse itself. He knew every bolt, every lens prism, every cubic foot of concrete. He knew the men. He had hired them. When we read his report today, converted into plain text on a glowing screen, we can feel the desperate attempt to impose logic on an illogical situation. Muirhead began by processing the physical inventory. This is the first dead end. In the kitchen, the fire was out. The ashes were cold. This gives us a timestamp of entropy, but not an event. The clock on the wall had stopped. Clocks of that era were mechanical, requiring human intervention to keep time. Its silence was merely a symptom of absence, not a clue to the time of departure. The pots were cleaned. The beds were made. Everything was in a state of suspended animation. There is a persistent internet rumor, a piece of digital folklore that appears in almost every forum discussion about this case, claiming that a meal was set on the table, half-eaten. This is false. The files show the kitchen was tidy. The men had finished their work. The distortion of facts begins here, where the human need for a dramatic narrative overwrites the mundane reality of an empty room. The investigation then moved to the gear. This provides us with a binary data point that refuses to resolve. Standard regulation required the keepers to wear oilskins, heavy, waterproof gear, when leaving the lighthouse structure. In the entrance hall, Muirhead found one set of oilskins hanging on its peg. It belonged to Donald MacArthur. This is a glitch in the protocol. If the men went out together, all three sets should be gone. If one stayed behind, he should be in the lighthouse. The presence of that single hanging coat implies a scenario that violates the operational logic of the lighthouse service. It suggests that MacArthur, a veteran mariner known for his experience, left the safety of the lighthouse without his protective gear, presumably in a rush. Or he never left at all and simply ceased to exist within the walls. Muirhead stared at that coat. We can imagine him standing in the drafty hallway, the smell of salt and damp wool in the air, trying to calculate the trajectory of a man running into a storm in his shirt sleeves. The data does not compute. Then there is the logbook. In modern data recovery, we look for corrupted sectors, places where the information writes over itself or displays impossible values. The logbook of the Flannan Isles is a physical manifestation of a corrupted sector. The entries for December 12th, 13th, and 14th describe a storm of terrifying magnitude. Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, wrote of winds that he had never witnessed in his career. He wrote that the principal keeper, James Duckett, was very quiet. He wrote that Donald MacArthur, the man whose coat was still in the hall, the man known for his brawling and toughness, was crying. The final entry on December 15th reads simply, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." Here is where the investigation hits the hard wall of reality. We have the meteorological records from the Lewis shoreline and passing ships for those specific dates. We have the data. There was no storm. The weather stations in the region recorded calm seas and light breezes on December 12th, 13th, and 14th. The violent atmospheric event described in the logbook, the storm that drove seasoned sailors to tears and prayer, existed only within the perception of the three men on the rock. This discrepancy is the blue screen of death for the historical investigator. We are forced to choose between two impossible conclusions. One, the meteorological data of the entire British Isles was wrong. Two, the keepers were hallucinating a cataclysm that was not happening. Muirhead read these entries. He held the book in his hands. He knew these men were reliable, sober, and experienced. He could not reconcile the text with the weather reports on his desk. In his final report, he glosses over this. He chooses to ignore the psychological data because it does not fit the mechanical model of an accident. He treats the logbook as a curiosity rather than the primary evidence of a psychological breakdown. The investigation moved to the West Landing. Here, Muirhead found the only signs of physical violence. An iron box containing supply ropes and weighing considerable poundage had been wrenched from its crevices and thrown 40 feet up the cliff. Iron railings were bent and twisted like wire. A block of stone, weighing more than a ton, had been displaced. This was the evidence Muirhead needed. He seized upon it. He constructed a theory of a freak wave, a sudden, colossal displacement of water that surged up the cliffside, sweeping the men away as they tried to secure the gear. It is a clean theory. It fits the parameters of physics. It explains the missing men. It closes the case file. But it does not explain the silence. It does not explain why MacArthur left without his coat. It does not explain the 3 days of dread recorded in the logbook before the wave hit. It does not explain why the logbook stated the storm had ended and the sea was calm on the morning of the disappearance. If a wave took them, it took them in a moment of calm, after they had already been broken by a storm that did not exist. The digital archaeology of this case eventually leads us to the telegrams. These are the short packets of data sent between the lighthouse tender Hesperus and the Northern Lighthouse Board. Reading them is like watching a heartbeat flatline. The first telegram announces the disappearance. Dreadful accident. The language is urgent. The subsequent telegrams become administrative. They discuss the rotation of relief keepers. They discuss the salary adjustments for the widows. They discuss the maintenance of the light. Within 2 weeks, the mystery was effectively deprecated. The bureaucracy absorbed the event. The why was replaced by the how much. The wall we hit in this investigation is not a lack of evidence, but a surplus of contradictions. We have a locked room mystery where the room is an entire island. We have a timeline that is out of sync with the rest of the world. We have a final log entry that sounds more like a prayer than a report. When we zoom in on the scans of the original documents, zooming in until the handwriting of Thomas Marshall becomes nothing but jagged pixels of black ink on a white background, we lose the humanity of it. We forget that these were men trapped in a liminal space, a place where the ocean and the sky meet, where the isolation is absolute. The investigation failed because it tried to apply the logic of the mainland to the logic of the edge. Muirhead filed his report. He concluded that the men had been swept away by the sea. The file was boxed. The box was shelved. The shelf was located in a basement in Edinburgh. And eventually, the contents were scanned and uploaded to a server. But the silence remains. The true dead end is the realization that the specific sequence of events is irretrievable. The data is not just encrypted, it is gone. We are left standing at the West Landing, looking at the twisted iron railings. We can measure the force required to bend the metal. We can calculate the foot-pounds of energy in a wave. We can analyze the ink composition of the logbook, but we cannot reconstruct the fear. The focus narrows down to a single, impossible gap between the entry "God is over all" and the arrival of the Hesperus. There is a void. In that void, the 3 men did not just die. They were erased. The light was relit by the relief crew. The mechanism turned. The lens magnified the beam. The ocean continued to crash against the basalt. The system reset itself. The dead end is the machine continuing to run without its operators. The files tell us everything about the lighthouse and nothing about the keepers. We are left with the sensation of looking at a screen that has frozen. displaying the last image before the power was cut. And that image is empty. The investigation did not end when the Hesperus returned to the mainland. In many ways, the departure of the relief vessel marked the beginning of a much colder, more suffocating phase of the mystery. The immediate panic of discovery was replaced by the slow, grinding bureaucracy of the Northern Lighthouse Board. Superintendent Robert Muirhead was tasked with compiling the official report. He was a man of engineering and logistics, not prone to flights of fancy. He had personally recruited all three of the missing men, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. He knew their service records. He knew their temperaments. And as he sat in the empty galley of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, surrounded by the silence of the Atlantic, he began to realize that the physical evidence was telling him two completely contradictory stories. Consider the geography. The Flannan Isles are not a gentle outpost. They are a cluster of 7 jagged rocks, the highest point of a submerged mountain range rising violently out of the ocean. Eilean Moor, the site of the lighthouse, is surrounded by cliffs that drop 200 feet straight down into the churning water. To access the lighthouse, there are 2 landings, the East Landing and the West Landing. The keepers were strictly instructed to use the landing that was in the lee of the wind. Muirhead found the East Landing untouched. The West Landing, however, had been subjected to violence that defied nautical physics. At the West Landing, iron railings had been wrenched from their concrete foundations. These were not decorative garden fences. They were heavy industrial barriers set into solid rock, designed to withstand the worst the North Atlantic could throw. Muirhead noted that a stone block weighing more than a ton had been dislodged and moved. We must pause to consider the force required to achieve this. We are not talking about high winds. We are talking about a concentrated kinetic impact, a hammer blow of water, occurring at an elevation of 110 feet above sea level. And yet, up in the lighthouse tower, at the summit of the island, the lantern room was pristine. The lamps were trimmed. The oil fountains were full. The lens was polished. If a storm of such biblical proportions had struck the island, a storm capable of ripping iron from rock 100 feet in the air, why was there no damage to the glass of the lantern room? Why was the kitchen tidy? Why was the gate at the top of the stairs closed? This is the discrepancy that plagued Muirhead. The exterior damage suggested a cataclysm. The interior condition suggested a calm afternoon. The only item out of place in the living quarters was the overturned chair by the kitchen table. For decades, storytellers have latched onto this chair as a sign of sudden interruption. But Muirhead, in his clinical fashion, noted something else. He noted the oilskins. The The regulations of the Northern Lighthouse Board were absolute. A keeper must wear his oilskins, heavy, waterproof gear, when leaving the lighthouse during a storm. When the search party arrived, they found 3 sets of gear. 2 were missing. 1 remained on its hook. The set belonging to Donald MacArthur was still hanging in the entryway. This single detail dismantles the theory of a collective accident. If the men had gone out to secure the landing during a storm, all 3 would have been wearing their gear. MacArthur, a veteran mariner, would never have stepped out into a gale in his shirt sleeves. This implies that whatever drew them out did not look like a storm. Or perhaps 2 went out into a calm, and the 3rd was forced to follow in such haste that he left his protection behind. But follow him into what? Muirhead spent days on the island during the investigation. He slept in the beds of the missing men. He listened to the wind howling through the vents. In his report, he concluded that the men must have been swept away by a freak wave while trying to secure equipment at the West Landing. He wrote that they had been caught by an unexpected progression of water that rose higher than any recorded tide. It was a conclusion born of necessity, not conviction. It was a way to close the file. It allowed the board to pay pensions to the widows and to assign new keepers to the rotation. But the private correspondence of the investigators reveals a deep, lingering unease. They could not explain the timeline. The logbook entries, which ceased on December 15th, described a storm that no ships in the area had reported. The barometer readings on the island had plummeted, while the mainland stations, just 20 miles away, recorded calm weather. The Flannan Isles seemed to have existed in a localized bubble of atmospheric anomaly, a pocket of high pressure and impossible waves that existed only for the 3 men on the rock and invisible to the rest of the world. After the investigation formally closed, the lighthouse went back into operation. But the atmosphere on Eilean Moor had shifted. The relief keepers who took over the rotation reported a heaviness in the air. They spoke of the acoustics of the tower. A lighthouse is a resonant chamber. The wind vibrating against the granite creates a hum, a low-frequency drone that can be felt in the teeth and the bones. Keepers began to report hearing their names called. They would be polishing the brass in the gallery, 160 feet above the sea, and hear a clear, distinct voice from the stairwell. Upon investigation, the stairwell would be empty. Others reported a sensation of extreme static charge, the hair on their arms standing up whenever they approached the precipice of the West Landing. This is where the story usually fades into folklore. But we are interested in the data. We are interested in the operational history that followed. For 70 years after the disappearance, the lighthouse was manned. 3 men, always 3, keeping the vigil. The logbooks from this period are dry and technical. But if you analyze the maintenance requests, a pattern emerges. There are repeated requests for repairs to the locking mechanisms of the external doors, bolts that would not slide, hinges that warped. The keepers were obsessed with the integrity of the seals. In 1971, the Northern Lighthouse Board automated the Flannan Isles Light. The era of the keepers was over. The great lens was modified, the living quarters were shuttered, and the human element was removed from the equation. The island was abandoned to the birds and the sheep. The installation of the automatic system was intended to end the mystery. Machines do not hallucinate. Machines do not write log entries about God or crying colleagues. Machines simply function. The lighthouse is now monitored remotely from the board's headquarters in Edinburgh. Telemetry data is beamed via satellite link. It reports the voltage of the batteries, the humidity of the lantern room, the rotation speed of the optic, and the status of the security seals. We are left with a structure that is no longer a home, but a sensor platform, a concrete needle sticking out of the dark water, processing data in the dark. The interior rooms, where Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur ate their final meal, are stripping slowly in the damp air. The paint peels in long, translucent ribbons. The iron stove is rusting into a pile of orange flake. But the narrowing of our story brings us to the present day. We are not looking at the ghosts of 1900. We are looking at the digital footprint of the facility right now. The lighthouse is equipped with intrusion sensors. These are simple magnetic contacts on the heavy outer doors and the internal gate to the lantern room. They are designed to alert the technicians in Edinburgh if a maintenance crew has arrived or if a storm has breached the tower. In the archives of the monitoring logs, buried amidst decades of flatline data, there are anomalies. These are not publicized because they are attributed to sensor malfunction or vibration errors. But the nature of the errors is specific. The telemetry occasionally registers a status change in the intrusion detection system. Specifically, the sensor on the internal gallery door, the heavy iron door that separates the living quarters from the light itself. The signal is brief, a binary switch flipping from 0 to 1 and back to 0. Closed, open, closed. It happens invariably during periods of extreme low pressure, when the waves are hammering the west landing. The data implies that the door, sealed inside a locked tower on an uninhabited rock, is physically moving. Technicians will tell you it is the wind buffeting the structure, causing the contacts to chatter. They will talk about metal fatigue and salt corrosion bridging the circuits. They offer mechanical explanations for mechanical failures. But the pattern persists. The signal does not stutter randomly. It is a single, clean pulse. The lighthouse stands there tonight. The light turns every 20 seconds, sweeping a beam across the empty ocean. Inside, the air is still. The dust is undisturbed. But on a server rack, in a climate-controlled room on the mainland, a small green LED blinks. It waits for the pressure to drop. It waits for the wind to rise. And then, in the silence of the data stream, the sensor trips. Someone is checking the light.